bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody. Slap versus stroke. Brian and I want to chat about how can you make an impact? How can you be effective? If you're listening to this podcast, you value freedom, you value making a difference, you value making a better world. The question is how. We've done a lot of past episodes on ideas and different strategies and so forth. But this one, Brian, I wanted to talk with you about the slap versus the stroke. In other words, do you slap people around who are doing the wrong thing, or do you kind of stroke ego and stroke people to be like, oh, let's persuade you this way and let's work within the system? You and I have kind of had some different experiences, and so maybe just high level, your reaction to that question. What does your experience tell you, and where does your heart lie?
Well, as a reformed or a recovering slapper, I do have some experience here, and I think you've experienced this too. I know with like online arguments, and I've had on air arguments with people. Yeah, and that is how a lot of people choose to get other people's attention. And this can apply to advocacy and various issues. Okay, I'll pick on the open carry guys. Okay. Walking around in public with a gun on your hip can be a slap to some people, depending on how you're doing it or depending on where you're doing it. Yeah. I'll take, for instance, the guys who walked into a Chipotle in, I think it was in Austin, Texas, a few years ago. I don't know if you remember seeing the pictures of this, but these guys didn't just have a gun on their hip. They walked in with their semi-automatic rifles slung across their chests like, Rambo was waiting to meet him for lunch or something. And it went over very, very poorly. Even the NRA said, guys, you're having impact, but it's not the positive kind. Yeah. Now, the stroke approach, I think, is actually the better approach on that. And for instance, I'll just say the gun owner who invites somebody to come shooting with them. Very informally, there's no political lecture or expectation. Yeah, you're going to be a total gun nut by the time we're done, but just come and see that we can have fun, that we can be responsible, and there's actually a place in civilized society for this. Which one of those do you think changed more minds in a positive way?
And so here's where I struggle with this, because I've been on both sides of this, and I see a lot of practical benefit from the stroke, right? From working within and persuading and being calm and diplomatic and so forth. But aren't there times, Brian, when there are certain impacts you have to make, if we're talking about making an impact, where you got to do a little slapping, and the slapping is the superior method to wake people up and call attention to an issue. And as you point out, they weren't using their gun and wielding it. They didn't have, hands on the trigger and things like this. It was just they were kind of mentally slapping people around or shocking their conscience, right? But then there's also much more confrontational type of slapping. I don't know, where do you see a potential balance in that? Is it only when, think of the founding fathers, right? Okay, first they were writing petitions to the king, and they were writing, treatises and tracts and newspaper articles and so forth, kind of
appealing to reason.
Yeah, exactly. Trying to use words, and then it started to get to the point where they needed to kind of slap you. And I don't know, to your point, when you read some of the writings back then, they were slapping people around, right? They were very bold and very in your face to kind of the status quo and the king and so forth. But in terms of raising the stakes and getting more confrontational, is it that it was a last resort and that they had kind of exhausted? They had tried to stroke their way to having more freedom, and then they figured out they had to start slapping people around. What are your thoughts?
I think in their case, they did exhaust every opportunity to persuade before they finally stood up to the king. And when they did, as I recall, it was a defensive kind of standing up, like when they sent the troops to disarm the colonists, take their powder, take their guns, at Lexington and Concord. That's when they said, okay, enough. And it's time to stop, persuading, and they physically resisted. I was trying to think of a more recent example. Ammon Bundy occupying the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge.
That's a slap.
That was a definite slap. And you know what? He was very unapologetic about how we had to make a hard stand to bring attention to the Hammond family and the injustice that they were suffering. He had gone and he had talked to the sheriff, Dave Ward, up there in Harney County, And Dave Ward gave the excuse, "Oh, I'm just doing my job. My hands are tied. I have to have this working relationship with the federal government."
Mm-hmm.
But Ammon told him, you can't allow this to happen, and if you don't do something, we're going to have to do something to bring attention to this.
Let me ask you a question, Brian. Does the justification for slapping, let's use Ammon Bundy's example, does it hinge on how it will be perceived by the public? Here's what I mean by that. You shared the example of the gun owner. He was well within his rights to, unless the private property owner had said, we don't want that here, and then he would be trespassing and so forth. But in terms of like walking around town and unless he's told otherwise, he's well within his rights. Ammon Bundy, hey, these are my rights and this is what I'm going to do. But as you point out in the gun example, the gun owner, that was received very poorly, where even the NRA was saying, you're casting the wrong image and people are going to react poorly. And so the impact could be net negative. Sure, some people are going to see that and be like, yeah, stick it to Chipotle and go Second Amendment. But overall, it's probably a step back for trying to increase support for, Second Amendment and gun rights. So let me ask you this as it pertains to Ammon Bundy. Was that a net negative, just in the sense that so many people reacted poorly to that? Yes, he was within his rights, and there were certainly the core group who were saying, yes, sticking up against the feds, and let's do it, and let's do more. But does the decision as to whether the slap is the right approach hinge on how the public is going to perceive it? And if people are going to have a negative reaction, even though you have the right to do it or it's the right thing to do and so forth, could that cause more overall harm in terms of making a good impact rather than the alternative? What are your thoughts?
That's a really good question. And believe it or not, I've actually had a lot of opportunities to talk with Ammon about this. And he maintains, even he struggled with what they were doing as far as knowing this is going to be perceived as something very provocative. Now, the fact that they had guns, I asked Lavoy Finicum, he did an interview with me about 10 days before he was killed, and I asked him, could you guys have done this without the guns? Because that's getting a lot of negative publicity. And his response was, if we had gone in there not being armed. Now, keep in mind, they didn't kick anybody out. The place was unoccupied when they got there. They went and basically started camping. Opened up the buildings and sat down and said, okay, by adverse possession, we will now take charge of this. But they never pointed a gun at anybody. They never threatened anybody. But Lavoy said if we hadn't been armed, he says, they would have come in and pepper sprayed us and zip tied us and rolled us up and been home in time for dinner. So it forced at least the authorities to stop and say, okay, we're not just going to roll over the top of these people because they're in a position to protect themselves. And Ammon knew that there was going to be some negative perception, but he said he felt, and this was just his personal conscience that was driving him, that he had to make a hard stand, and he was standing up for his fellow man. More than he was standing against what the feds had been doing to the Hammond family, he was standing up for the Hammond family and saying this injustice can't continue. Mm-hmm. And as hard as it was, if you were to ask him today, was it worth it? He'd say it was, even though primarily, I would guess 90% of the people who are aware of it probably misunderstand what was actually going on there and still refer to it as a standoff, when in fact no standoff ever took place.
I wonder also, Brian, how the media affects this issue, right? Like the opportunities where someone can convey directly to the public what's at stake, what's happening, why their impact is a positive thing, even if it's potentially controversial. Whereas if the interpretation of your action and all the little details that are lost or skewed or added are in the position, the media has control over that to set the narrative, right? Because I think a lot of the public, as you point out, like misunderstand what happened and what they were doing and who was armed and why and so forth. But I wonder if that is kind of a big determination for us when we try and figure out, like, look, if I'm going to take a stand, we're recording this, we're publishing it a few days later, but we're recording this on June 5th, 30 years after Tank Man in Tiananmen Square in China. That was yesterday as we're recording this, June 4th. And good heavens, that made an impact. It still makes an impact. And And here's a guy who was slapping a tank around, a column of tanks who are, and the guy in the lead tank would try and like pivot to the right. And this guy is just holding some grocery sacks, walking across this like military installation. And so the tank starts to move and then he moves, and the tank tries to move and you got to imagine the soldier in the tank is like, oh crap, like I don't want to do this. Right. And I got my orders, but this is going to be a nightmare if this happens. So let me just go around you. And then the guy's like, nope, I'm gonna, and man, that's a slap, right? And there weren't words, there wasn't a whole lot of like narrative that could be spun on it. That was just a really concrete visual for me to see raw power and the personification of the state. And its aggression, especially to crack down on the protests in Tiananmen Square. For me, it was a great visualization. That he spoke, Tank Man spoke directly to me. And so I think that action was powerful. Whereas if we're at the mercy of other people to tell the narrative, I wonder if that, Brian, should lead us to question whether it's the right thing to do if we're not going to have that opportunity to communicate so directly to people who would more easily understand why we're slapping.
And the narrative is definitely something that's one of the battlegrounds. Most of the people who really believe that there was a standoff in Oregon and Ammon Bundy went up there and provoked, a bunch of, action against the feds, primarily got their information from the media.
Right.
And that's why it's incomplete. They know some of the facts, but they don't know enough of the facts to understand how could a person hold the moral high ground doing what he did. Now, I've talked to him enough that I'm pretty convinced. Yeah, he didn't surrender the moral high ground, even though it was a very imperfect and maybe even clumsy way of getting people's attention. And he would tell you, there's no perfect way. But depending on what you're trying to do, for Tank Man, trying to put a flower down the barrel of the tank's gun probably wasn't going to work. Mm-hmm. He stood there and dared them to run him over. And by that action, it spoke very boldly. That's probably one of the best pictures of defiance that I can think of within my lifetime.
I want to share this, Brian, as we talk about this balance between slap versus stroke. It's tough because when you're slapping, there are people who are going to be offended, who are going to dislike you, put you like you're in the other tribe, you're not in my tribe, right? And if you're ever then trying to take this stroke method and be more effective in trying to build consensus and persuade people to your point of view, I almost feel like in some respects, there's probably some opportunity to do both. In fact, I think there definitely is opportunity to do both, but it's hard and it's very selective. I kind of feel like you have to determine in your sphere of influence and with what you're doing, are you a slapper or are you a stroker? Here's what I mean. I used to be a slapper, right? When I was first getting involved in politics, I was very critical and pointing out where people were wrong, and I would get up and committee meetings and in the Republican Party and such senator is wrong and here's why and we need to fix this and I motioned this and I moved that and it was more confrontational to try and affect change, and we did make some change. I did have some momentum and some effect slapping, but later on when I then started Libertas, this is back in 2011, and our goal is to now get the legislature to pass laws that increase freedom. I find myself having to work with people who I was previously slapping, or even when I was back in the campaign world, like when I was on Mike Lee's campaign in 2009, 2010, I was, of course, at odds with campaign staffers who were supporting the other candidates. And so here I am attacking those candidates or trying to build up my guy, and it's a competition, it's a battle. And there's some hard feelings on both sides because their paycheck is riding on the success of their guy who I'm trying to knock down. So the staffers feel it personally. Well, those staffers are out of their job because Mike Lee gets elected, and now they have to do other things. And then years later, some of them are lobbyists, and I'm having to work with them up at the Capitol. And you know what I mean? And so you end up interacting with people who might have been on the tail end of your slaps, who might have been on the receiving end, excuse me. So I want that to be in the listener's mind for consideration as we're trying to figure out our approach, because if you ever want to be in a position of influence and building consensus and working with people, you got to really have, I think, restraint and selective use of slapping, because you got to recognize that there's some collateral consequences that are going to come that maybe you don't experience at that time, but people are going to remember. It's going to leave a little mark, and you slap him around, and 4 years later, he's going to grumble and tell some other person who then doesn't want to work with you on that stroking thing because, oh, you slapped my buddy 4 years ago. So that's a balance that I foresee. Where you were very involved in slapping, Brian, do you you're out much more communicating? I sense at least a more positive message now with what you're trying to do and really push principles rather than kind of the red meat, slap people. What's been your transition like, and have you sensed anything similar?
I think the biggest transition that I've experienced personally is I have found it more productive to help people understand what I stand for as opposed to what I'm against.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that I don't still fall prey to, going off on something, but what it means to me is diplomacy should be the first resort. The slap should be, kind of a last resort. I think of Martin Luther nailing those theses to the door of the cathedral. He had tried. That wasn't his first attempt to get the attention of the church and to tell them there needs to be some reform happening here. But when he finally felt like, this is falling on deaf ears, that's when he took that bold step, and it was a big slap to nail those theses. But his explanation was, here I stand.
Yeah.
This is what I have to do. And so when you find that nothing else is getting attention, that's likely a place where a slap could be appropriate.
And maybe that's a way to temper the slap is by showing that you've done your due diligence. Like, look, I've tried to reason with you people, and I've tried to, reach out, and I've tried to calmly explain, but you're not listening and you're not changing, and I need to take a stand. So here I stand. And maybe then people can respect you and say, no, I get it. Like, you gave us a chance and we disagree. So I get what you're doing. Whereas if you come out with a machine gun, you're you're not giving people a chance to come to your side before you declare war against them. Maybe that's a way to balance it.
Well, and you have the added benefit at that point. If you've been using persuasion, if you have been stroking them and trying to lead them along or, speaking the truth to them with love and letting them reject it if they want to, there will come a point where they will recognize, you know what, Connor, you have always been straightforward with me. You've always told me where you were coming from, and I've never felt forced by you, but now you're taking this really hard stand. I believe they would be more likely to take you seriously because you haven't taken that hard stand. You've reserved it for when you really feel like it matters.
Yeah.
And it may or may not change their mind, but I think at least they're going to have to stop and question. He's never taken this hard of a stand before, as opposed to, oh, he's always going off like that.
Some important thoughts to consider as you, dear listener, are trying to weigh how you can make an impact on the approach to take. Obviously, with social media whipping everybody into a fervor, it's very easy to slap people, but give some consideration for how you can go the stroking method instead and trying to persuade and be positive and argue for something rather than just argue against things. I've seen far more impact in my own life of taking that approach, reserving the slapping where appropriate and using that selectively. But something to consider as we all try and consider how to make an impact. So that's Society and the State, episode 147. Stick around next time. We're going to talk about taxation, specifically the sales tax. And there's this idea trickling around in our state and many other states to tax not just the things you buy, the goods, but also the services. Is that a good idea or why? There's some interesting thoughts there. So hope to see you next time. Make sure you're subscribed. We'll see you on Society and the State.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.